Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. For those wondering about the thumbnail where it's baby steps get on a Baht bus, well, first of all, what's a Baht bus? Here in Thailand, that's kind of a euphemism in English for what's called a song tao, which is a form of mass transit, sort of a near distance mass transit, if you will, these kind of Baht buses. But as you can see, that is actually, and I'll put a link in the description below to a clip, that is from What About Bob? That's that famous scene, baby steps, get on a bus, baby steps, get on a bus, Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss. That is a great and funny movie. I thought of that when I was recently listening to a recent podcast on Palisades Gold Radio here on YouTube, and it was with a gentleman named Matt Riley, who apparently is a former naval officer and is somebody that's been actually watching this in-bridge system and everything we've been seeing with regard to this sort of evolution or continuing evolution of the, what should we call it, the infrastructure of international trade, if you will, or the infrastructure of global capital movement. And it's an interesting podcast. I urge those who are watching this video, there's a link in the description below, go check it out. The long story short though, there's a clip in there where they're talking about this evolution of in-bridge. And we've recently talked about that. BIS apparently stepped away, although I think there was more going on there. And there's speculation as to what exactly it is. Is it a platform? It's my understanding, the best definition of it is a protocol. So it's sort of a series of things that occur or mechanisms that are triggered when certain types of trade occur in different types of currency. And it was very interesting. He was talking about the fact it doesn't necessarily have to use central bank, inputs. It can utilize other things. But one thing he noted, before I get into this part, I think it's worth pointing out, there's a lot of talk in the ether of YouTube, FinTwit, folks that are out there that are sort of aware of the geopolitics and know about international trade, international currencies, how they interact with each other, geopolitics, gold, how that plays in, oil, how that plays in. Talking about all this stuff, the petrodollar, a lot of hyperbole about, oh, it's the end of the dollar. No, it's not. And I recently could put a fine point on, I think, what people are missing, and that is, at least with regard to in-bridge, it doesn't look like any of the participants are looking to replace the dollar. That's the big thing I don't think people are understanding. What it looks to me like they're trying to at least have an alternative for is something like SWIFT, as I've discussed in other videos, a kind of transfer-wise, if you will, for international banks, for central banks, etc., that can be utilized, that is not going to use the same on-ramp, off-ramp, the same nodes, if you will, the same railroad tracks, to use an analogy, to use a metaphor with regard to how this works. Not going to be using those same channels. It's going to utilize its own mechanism for doing this, its own protocol, which is sort of what it is. And then in that same podcast, he goes on to say, you need to stop thinking in terms, and they start, excuse me, let me back up. He said, but while they're doing, so on the one level, I think people aren't understanding this, that they're building this protocol to act as an alternative for SWIFT. But back to the notion of sort of a replacements for the dollar, et cetera, again, I don't think that's what's going on here with in-bridge. I think they're primarily trying to create an alternative protocol to something like SWIFT. Meanwhile, or sort of simultaneously, let's step back into, okay, let's say they were trying to do that, and that is where gold comes in. They start talking about gold. And again, I don't think people are fully getting this, that, look, as it sits now, it looks to me like in-bridge can work. BIS has actually said that when on their way out the door. They sort of said, look, the parties to this thing can actually make this thing work themselves. We've shown it can work. We basically tested it. It can work. And it's not there to replace the dollar. Again, it's like an alternative set of pipelines, if you will. It's like having a new pipeline for capital is one way to look at it. Now, here's sort of the interesting part. They get into the notion that, well, it looks like that these central banks are building towards something. And he basically says, that something is gold. And while they're having their discussion, they're sitting there saying, you know, I think the announcer or the interviewer says, well, you know, how many pounds, how many ounces are we talking about? And Mr. Riley, who was being interviewed, said, hey, you need to stop thinking of it in those terms. You need to start thinking of it in terms of grams and kilos. Well, guess what? There's another weight and measure for gold. And the minute I heard it, I was like, oh, I just sort of hit myself in the head. I was like, there's another weight and measure out in this world for gold, and that's the Thai baht, the baht itself. Baht itself is a weight and measurement of gold, a unique one. And it's one that I've noted for years as something that I find really fascinating and novel about Thailand. But yeah, that is another alternative. Now, how exactly that could be played out in the context of this emerging possible protocol remains to be seen. Again, I think it's possible for Enbridge to work without the need for incorporating gold, if you look at it purely as just, again, an alternative pipeline to SWIFT. But again, if it was to bring on gold, it's interesting that they brought that up in that interview, that they said, oh, well, you maybe need to stop thinking in terms of pounds and ounces. Well, maybe you Westerners need to stop thinking in terms of pounds, ounces, kilos, and grams, and start seriously looking at other weights and measures around the world, most notably the Thai baht, because it's worth pointing out the Bank of Thailand is one of the major participants in this upcoming Enbridge protocol. And it's also worth noting, as I've stated in other videos on this channel and my personal channel, you know, at the end of the day, we're watching sort of Mackinder's World Island kind of thinking play out with the Heartland and the Rimland. And again, this Enbridge protocol looks to me like it's trying to create these capital pipelines to hook in to the World Island, if you will, through the Rimland, if you will, through the global south, via the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Thailand, and the Central Bank of the UAE. And at the end of the day, one of those countries has its own unique weight and measurement of gold, that being Thailand, and exactly how that may one day be interacting with the international currency markets, the international trade market, remains to be seen. But we're certainly going to keep you updated on this channel as the situation evolves.